Good morning, everyone. Glad to be here with you on this celebration Sunday. Hey, for Easter Sunday. Glad you guys could be here. Started a little bit late. We had a little bit of a plumbing problem in the back. Had to go clean it up. We've had a lot of rain the past 24 hours, and I could see it in the ditches when I was going and getting our church members and stuff. And if you know what you're looking for, you can see it. It was dirt and leaves and everything. It was kind of washed downstream, but it's left because the water receded, right? And it's left it all on the road, on the deal. I think there were some roads flooded here for at least a little while. But yeah, it's been good. We need the rain. Um, Hopefully set us up for a good summer. I was just talking to somebody about that. They was talking about how uh, it's raining and all this and whatever. But if you know the saying, April showers bring May flowers, we expect rain here in Oklahoma. That's what the individual was talking about was this is to be expected during this time. We usually start a little bit earlier. We don't get it all at once, but it's good. And I don't know that the part that needs it the most, the western part, is getting enough, but that's okay. We know that it will be really green here before too long. We're still in chapter 3. Remember, we was talking about the relationships and the things that we try to build as followers and believers. Um, we're a little bit behind, so we may be coming up on the Easter specific Bible study later on. But we're still in chapter 3, and we're in the second half of the chapter. It says the Bible study author always has a question for us. What can cause someone to lose hope in a difficult circumstance? What factors can help a person find hope even in desperate situations? Well, what can cause someone to lose hope in a difficult circumstance? There's a couple situations right now where you might not understand or know of that's going on in people's lives. But one of those situations is when people, frankly, depend on other people, right? There's an agreement or some type of relationship where it takes both parties, doesn't have to be individuals, both sides of the. It could be even multiple situation, multiple angles, three, four people at a time, and that's what the Bible study author is getting at. What can cause someone to lose hope is depending on humans, depending on people, especially in a difficult circumstance where we might not know what's ahead of us and where we're going and all that, but we're depending on somebody else to get us there or to help us along or to even back us up, right? Um, I always go back to the part I was just preaching about a few weeks ago. Is there was a time in my life where I had depended on certain people to be there for me, and once we got to that point, right? Once I was starting college, I didn't have those people with me, and it was for not reasons that anybody could control, but I lost hope in that field or that area of interest and what I wanted to do, what I wanted to accomplish. On the flip side, what factors can help a person find hope even in desperate situations? Uh, Probably a good phrase, a good talking to, right? Um, yeah, a a the relationships that we try to engage in, right? Something along the way, we will be able to hopefully see something better, right? That's why we want to be friends with somebody is because they're funnier than us or we have good camaraderie, right? We feed off of one another's energy. Um, and we're building something better. Even jobs, the most rewarding positions that you can take as an employee, um, or even as a supervisor, the people that you bring on, the most rewarding of those are the ones that are building to something better, that are building to something greater, right? The partnership, it becomes something that thrives instead of recedes or dwindles, right? When we're talking about those types of deals, we recognize a tide is a cycle, right? Is a coming and going, ebb and flow. Well, the best part of it is when they're building towards something. The bad part, which we don't like to recognize sometimes, but it is a cycle because we start creating habits and whatnot, is when it starts receding, right? And that's when we get into a little bit of a downturn, with our mentality and all that. That's what the Bible study author is talking about here, is that cycle, right? God, he doesn't promise us trials. He doesn't promise us bad times, but he says we're going to experience them, right? So it's a little bit of a foretelling that things are going to get bad. Things are going to not go the way you think they're going to go, but he gives us hope, right? So there's kind of a cycle there. We don't want to get caught in the low point. We want to stay on the high side. And what he's talking about, it says, he gives an illustration. People sometimes refer to the first hour after a medical or tragic disaster as the golden hour. At that moment, hope is at its highest. As time passes, hope diminishes. Medical responders and emergency responders work furiously because of that hope. On the other side of the equation, those who have experienced the emergency sometimes struggle to keep hope alive. As believers, we have a solid reason for hope, even in the midst of suffering. And so, picking up in verse 13 here, in First Peter chapter 3, and who will harm you if you are deeply committed to what is good? Who will harm you if you are deeply committed to what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness, you are blessed. Do not fear what they fear or be disturbed, but honor the Messiah as Lord in your hearts. Always be ready to give a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. However, do this with gentleness and respect, keeping your conscience clear, so that when you are accused, those who denounce your Christian life will be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. And moving on, it says, For Christ also suffered for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring you to God, after being put to death in the fleshly realm, but made alive in the spiritual realm. In that state, he also went and made a proclamation to the spirits in prison, who in the past were disobedient when God patiently waited in the days of Noah while an ark was being prepared. In it, a few, that is, 8 people, were saved through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not the removal of the filth of the flesh, but the pledge of a good conscience towards God, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And now that he has gone into heaven, he is at God's right hand with angels, authorities, and powers subject to him. It says, given a little bit more, it says, that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger is a trite statement. Do we know what trite is? Trite means that it's too much. It's overused. And yet there is at least an element of truth to it when it comes to living as a Christian in an environment that is hostile to one's faith. By enduring suffering like Jesus, it may be that the very people who persecute us begin to marvel at the hope that is in us and inquire as to how it can be their own. That which they reviled becomes that which they desire. How then can we suffer like this? By regarding Christ as holy. The fear of God, not the fear of man, leads to the salvation of men and the glory of God. It says, reflect on the times when you suffered or felt persecuted for your faith. There's probably quite a few times that we can just point to easily, right? But it goes on. The Bible study author says Peter drew in his listeners with a rhetorical question. It says, "Who then?" What do you say? Reading out of the Holman Christian. And who will harm you if you are deeply committed to what is good? Who then will harm you if you are devoted to what is good? Those two different translations there, and that's what his point is. It's not a question that you can easily dismiss, right? But it's not a question that necessarily needs a response. That's what rhetorical means. He's trying to get you to think. This is reciting speech to be able to make a point, make a more a deeper point, right? It's a little bit of a discussion. And he sums up the answer is, but even if you should suffer for righteousness, you are blessed. Do not fear them or be intimidated, but in your hearts regard Christ the Lord as holy, ready at any time to give a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. And again, talking about what the Bible study author summed up. Says, by enduring suffering like Jesus, it may be that the very people who persecute us begin to marvel at the hope that is in us, right? We've all been in tough situations where it might be dire, might be bleak, it looks like there is no hope. A simple situation could be that there's a team or a group, or maybe even one really strong individual that act as two people, right? And they're against you. And for whatever reason, it could be physical, it could be mental, it could be spiritual, right? We battle with that as Native people in here in this area. We're facing somebody that's a Goliath, and we might regard ourselves smaller than even David, right? We might not have any skills when we're talking about the situation that we're in. But that's what the Bible study author is talking about, but also what the author is writing about. It says, the literary and historical context of the letter demands that one interpret Peter's question as referring not only to the earthly life of a believer, but also to the final day of judgment. And God will eternally reward the faithfulness of those who do good in the face of suffering. Despite persecution, believers are called to be zealous for righteousness, knowing that nothing can ultimately harm the believer is a balm for the suffering soul. No one can be against those whom God defends. And God sets his favor on those who suffer for Christ. In this light, believers can respond to persecution with gratitude. This does not mean that the suffering itself is a blessing. Rather, Peter pulled the gaze of suffering believers toward the eternal end, where God forever blesses them. And given God's favor and such suffering is not something to fear. Believers need not to give into the intimidation that accompanies such tactics. God should be feared, but not other humans. The antidote for such fear is to regard Christ the Lord as holy. And then moving on into the part where we are that reflection, right? And this is what it means a little bit. That when we are being like Christ, when we're being Christian, what people see, right, is that same persecution which took place just a couple days ago in the context of the Holy Week, the Easter weekend, what we're celebrating today, right? Um, is that all that suffering meant something stronger, and because people, I don't know that anybody was. There had to have been people that were changed, but they didn't talk about it, right? They just seen him suffering and were like, man, that's bad. That's a lot of stuff. But it was his suffering that allows us to be able to be in that relationship with God because he paid for that, right? Which we should have taken on ourselves, but because it was cast on him, and he didn't lose hope. He had it in his mind that God was performing a plan, was ultimately going to redeem him, was going to lift him up, was going to exalt him. He was able to give all that, and it wasn't because he wanted to do any of that. Obviously, he was God. He was wanting to save his creation, but when it goes down and we talk about a reason, right? The reason was redemption. The reason was God loved us. In that same way, when we're being Christ-like, when we're out there suffering and doing whatever, and we're being that image of God, that's the reason that we can give people why we suffer, right? And as long as it's true, as long as it's valid, right? That we're suffering because we love people or we love God, we point them towards Christ. We're gonna ultimately make it because that's the promise. We're not promised anything here. We're not promised an easy life. We're not promised these things work out to everybody's favor and our favor especially. But we can look to the hope that is in Christ Jesus, that when he died on that cross, our sins were paid for. And when he was resurrected and he was exalted, he was what Peter wrote there at the end, right? Now that he has gone into heaven, he is at God's right hand with angels, authorities, and powers subject to him. We also can be in that relationship. We can also claim our spot in heaven that he had given. The command to defend the faith that might be interpreted. The faith might be interpreted to justify a degree of harshness. However, a proper balance between gentleness and reverence allows Christians to maintain a clear conscience before the Lord and an effective witness before the world. Of course, the example of godly conduct can be and often will be rejected, yet in the last days, those who reject it will be put to shame. Again, talking about ultimately what we're trying to accomplish is that reunification with our Lord. It is never God's will for a Christian to do evil. It is often God's will that we suffer at the hands of evil for doing good. Such suffering is not an excuse for doing evil. It is inconsistent with the way of Jesus. The opposition believers face is never outside of God's sovereignty or providence. And this is important because, again, when we're trying to act Christian-like, when we're trying to act how we've been blessed, we shouldn't go too far in our response, and it becomes then an attack. We become the attacker ourselves. And this is a prime example when we get our feelings hurt, teasing, right? We know natives like to tease and whatnot, but then we get to teasing, and then our feelers get hurt, and then we act out, and we say something that's probably derogatory, right? We're not in the teasing mode anymore. We're trying to attack and make somebody feel as sad as we feel. That's not what God has ordained us to do. In fact, he told us to lift each other up. I like the where is it at? Let's see here. The way it's described in Ephesians. says to edify one another. Mm, I can't point to it right away, but it's in Ephesians there, where it talks about lifting each other up instead of breaking each other down. Because it says, moving on, it says, for Christ also suffered for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring you to God, after being put to death in the fleshly realm, but made alive in the spiritual realm. Despite sinless perfection, Jesus suffered at the hands of unrighteous people. Believers can expect no better treatment by the world. Christian suffering is real, but it also unites believers with Christ as they follow his example by enduring persecution with godliness. Suffering provided the path to exaltation and glory for Christ, and it provides a similar path to honor and glorification for his followers. Though Jesus endured physical death, he was made alive by the Spirit. Likewise, followers of Christ, though they encounter suffering, will ultimately partake in his resurrection. This would have been both a comfort and an encouragement to the persecuted saints in Asia Minor, and even extended to us today. Right? We can look at what doing the right thing ultimately led to. Especially at people, when we was talking about the original question with the Bible study author, where is it? So what can cause someone to lose hope in a difficult circumstance? We could only try to put ourselves in Jesus's shoes when he was on that cross, right? And it wasn't even the people that he thought would have put him there, right? He knew ahead of time, but at the same time, he probably had feelings that, these people would have come to at some point and been like, well, let's try to give him a fair chance and all that, because they were not paying attention. They weren't trying to be righteous, right? That makes them unrighteous. You can only be one or the other. There's no in between. In fact, God doesn't allow the in between. He talks about being lukewarm is worse than being hot or cold, because you don't do anything. Hot water can boil food, make tea, all the type of stuff. Cold water can refresh you and replenish you and help take care of you in some circumstances. But that lukewarm doesn't really do anything. It doesn't help you or doesn't hurt you either. And that's the thing. It says Peter emphasized two things regarding Jesus' sufferings. First, he died for sins. This was a common part of the Christian confession in the first century and remains a foundational element of faith. Second, Jesus died for all. Jesus' suffering was unique in that it was redemptive. While believers experience suffering, they do not suffer as Jesus did. Our suffering can never atone for sin. It only serves to conform us to his image, right? We're not going to get anything. We're not going to be able to pay for anything for our suffering, and that's what the Bible study author is talking about. When Peter was writing here, for Christ also suffered for sins once for all. Easter represents, the Good Friday represents that, the Passover celebration that was going on that time. That's what represented that paying of that sin debt, is that he died, right? And that was the only way that anybody could be redeemed. And it wasn't just for himself to complete what he was tasked to do. It was for everybody else, because he lived that perfect life. There had to be that perfect sacrifice that was human, right? So, and that's why it's important that he was holy God, but he was also holy human, and being able to accomplish that took him right to the edge of what he was able to withstand, but he was able to accomplish it. And that suffering that he had up until then was the proper amount of suffering to be able to take care of everything. Even when they pierced his side, and you hear all the details of that event, that was what was needed to be able to accomplish that. We can't add any more to that because we cannot submit ourselves as atoning sacrifices for anything that we do. We have to lay it at his feet. We have to lay it at the cross to be able to be that redemptive product that that he promised us. So it's made proclamation spirits in prison, and then this gets into a little bit of a theological study. Interpreting verse 19 and the first part of verse 20 has been challenging for scholars through the centuries. Many, such as Augustine, believe Peter was talking about Christ preaching through Noah in the days before the flood. If so, the Spirit's imprisonment was more metaphorical in nature. Others contend the captive spirits were Old Testament believers freed by Jesus between his death and his resurrection. However, most evangelicals hold that Peter was highlighting Jesus' proclamation of victory over the powers of evil and sin. Likely he spoke to angels who were imprisoned until their time of judgment in the last days. Again, going out and accomplishing everything that he was tasked to do, and because he was put to death here on earth, that allowed him to continue on and do his spiritual work before being resurrected, which is what we observe on Easter Sunday. Peter compared the salvation of a small number to the judgment executed on a vast number of individuals during the flood. His intent was to assure the believers in Asia Minor that they were like the 8 who had been spared, even though they had to endure the flood. They were among the few saved, while others were condemned to death. As a result of this salvation, Christians must persevere, relying on God's care and proclaiming his patience toward those who have not yet repented. The same way that Noah's salvation was brought about through the flood, our salvation will survive judgment. Of course, scholars also see a connection to baptism, which is fleshed out in the following verses, and talking about what he was going to, what it means, what it allows us to be able to claim. As noted, Peter used the image of the physical flood to symbolize the spiritual death associated with baptism. The word used here means to dip or to sink. It involves complete submersion, validating immersion as the proper means of Christian baptism. It should be emphasized that Peter's reference to being saved through water in verse 20 does not suggest that baptism has any redemptive power. The spiritual benefit of baptism rests in the opportunity it provides for Christians to demonstrate obedience and to publicly proclaim their death to sin and renewal in Christ. The symbolic association with Jesus' death and resurrection reflects the salvation he provides. Rather than removing dirt from the body, baptism emphasizes a spiritual cleansing from sin. Peter's focus was on the internal purification, not external appearances. In traditional thought, the right hand was the seat of authority and power. Here in verse 22, Peter stresses that Jesus' death and resurrection affirms his authority over angels, authorities, and powers. The terms all refer to supernatural entities. The anonymous writer of Hebrews noted that Jesus is superior to angels. This would include even fallen angels who deny his authority and attempt to lead people into sin. In fact, given that one would expect heavenly angels to submit to Christ, it is likely demonic forces were what Peter had in view when he was writing this. Peter made it abundantly clear that the resurrected Christ is Lord of all. As noted, no force, whether natural or supernatural, could overcome him or stand in the way of his plans being worked out on behalf of his children. Knowing that Jesus was still in control would have helped the Christians in Asia Minor to navigate persecution and suffering. It still should provide encouragement to believers today. Jesus hasn't surrendered his people to the power of evil, even if they suffer until they die. And Jesus defeated every wicked force when he died and came back to life. So believers will also rule with him. And again, talking about what the promise actually shows us when we're trying to be Christ-like or be Christian is focused on the eternal gift, the eternal promise that he's given us, not so much what we're dealing with here. Because what we're dealing with here is going to be a struggle. At times, it's going to be too much. Our human emotions do get in the way of certain aspects of our life, right? Grief can cause us to become emotional. Anger can cause us to become emotional, and both of those, I guess they're both on one side. Happiness, right? We can even throw that in there when we're trying to be, how would you say it? Well, when we're trying to substitute, we're trying to take substance for that happiness, even though it gives us euphoria, right? But it's not focused on the eternal. You're focused on now. You're focused on trying to be happy for a few days, few hours, few minutes, right? And when you're not focused on the Lord and Jesus, what he's trying to deliver to us, that goes away real quick. You still have to deal with this world, and that's what Peter ultimately is talking about, is that it's gonna be tough, and it's going to at times be disappointing. At times it's going to be discouraging, but you have hope. You have everlasting hope that Jesus delivered on the cross, that you can focus on and be able to suffer for him, not suffer for ourselves, suffer for our family and all that type of stuff, but suffering for him, doing the right thing because he expects it, not because anybody else expects it, not even because we expect it. We might think that we're doing the right thing, and say what? Until he arrives again, until what he's promised us, right? And that's the focus that Peter is trying to show his followers in this letter, but also extends to us today, is that suffering for him is what ultimately will get us through some of these things. That's what he's trying to show us. So that will wrap up our study there. Again, we're moving right along here. We've got a little bit. I know at some point we're going to come across we're going to come across our I don't know which one it is. It doesn't tell me on this guide here, but we come across our Easter one, and we'll do that then. We haven't been able to do some of these things, but we'll get it done. And so, is there any comments? Any real quick? Any comments, questions before we jump into worship time? All right. Well, Chris, would you dismiss us from Sunday school? The prayer.